The first time I realized my parents loved my brother more than me. I was 8 years old. It was my birthday. Or at least it was supposed to be. The dining room smelled like chocolate cake and vanilla frosting. My mother had spent the entire afternoon baking, and for a while I thought it meant something special. I remember sitting at the kitchen table swinging my legs nervously. "Mom, when are we going to light the candles?" I asked. She didn't even look up. "After your brother gets home from practice." My brother Daniel was 12. He played soccer, basketball, baseball, basically anything that involved a ball and a crowd cheering his name. Everything in our house revolved around Daniel. His games, his grades, his trophies. My birthday apparently revolved around him too. An hour later the front door slammed open. "Mom! Dad! You won't believe it!" Daniel shouted. My parents rushed to him like he was a celebrity returning from war. "What happened?" Dad asked. "I scored the winning goal." My mother gasped dramatically. "That's incredible." Then she grabbed the cake from the counter. I smiled, thinking finally the moment had come. But when she placed it on the table, the icing read, "Congratulations, Daniel." I stared at the cake. The candles spelled the number 12, not 8. I remember looking up slowly. "Mom, this was supposed to be my birthday cake." She waved her hand dismissively. "Oh honey, don't make everything about you." Daniel laughed. "Yeah, Emma. Don't be so sensitive." That night everyone sang happy birthday to Daniel. I sat at the end of the table quietly while they celebrated him. No one noticed I didn't blow out the candles. No one noticed I didn't eat any cake. That was the night I learned something important. In my family, I wasn't the main character. I wasn't even a supporting character. I was background noise. Growing up, the pattern never changed. Daniel was the golden child. I was the reminder that my parents had another kid. When Daniel brought home a B on a test, my parents told him he worked so hard. When I brought home straight A's, my father would glance at the report card and shrug. "Well, that's expected." Daniel got a brand new car when he turned 16. I got a lecture about responsibility and how nothing in life was free. Daniel went to a private university fully paid for. When I asked about college, my mother said something I'll never forget. "You're a girl, Emma. You'll get married someday. Your husband can help with that." So I did what forgotten children learn to do. I stopped asking. I worked 2 jobs. I applied for scholarships. And at 18, I moved out. The funny thing about distance is that it makes family pretend they care again. Every once in a while my mother would call. Not to ask how I was doing, but to talk about Daniel. "Your brother just bought a new car. Your brother got promoted. Your brother is thinking about buying a house." It was always Daniel. 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 By the time I turned 27, I had accepted something. My parents didn't hate me. They just never saw me. Everything started to change the day I met Michael. But the real reason my family would regret everything they ever did to me wouldn't happen until my wedding day. And when the truth finally came out, my parents realized something too late. The daughter they ignored for 20 years was the only one who had never betrayed them. Michael walked into my life on a Tuesday afternoon when I was running purely on coffee and exhaustion. At that time I was working 2 jobs. During the day I worked as a junior accountant at a small logistics company. At night I handled bookkeeping for a restaurant 3 blocks away from my apartment. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid my rent. And more importantly, it was mine. No one had given it to me. No one had helped me build it. That was something my parents would never understand. They believed success only counted if it came with applause. I met Michael at a coffee shop across from my office. I was sitting in the corner trying to finish a report before my shift ended, when someone set a cup of coffee down in front of me. I looked up confused. A tall man with dark hair and an easy smile stood there. "You look like someone who's been fighting Excel spreadsheets for 3 hours, he said. I blinked. "That obvious?" He laughed. "I'm guessing accountant?" "Junior accountant," I corrected. "Still counts." I hesitated. "You didn't have to buy me coffee." He shrugged casually. "You looked like you were about to declare war on that laptop." Something about him was calm. Not flashy. Not arrogant. Just relaxed in a way that made the world feel quieter. We ended up talking for 20 minutes. Then an hour. Then somehow the coffee shop was closing. Michael never acted impressed by titles or money. When I told him I worked 2 jobs, he didn't pity me. He respected it. When I explained how I paid my way through college, he listened like it mattered. Most people didn't. To most people, my story sounded like background noise compared to Daniel's glamorous life. But Michael paid attention. And that was rare. 3 months later, he met my parents. That dinner went exactly the way I expected. Terribly. The moment we walked into the house, my mother looked Michael up and down like she was inspecting used furniture. "What do you do?" she asked immediately. Michael answered politely. "I work in construction management." My father raised an eyebrow. "Construction?" Michael nodded. "I oversee development projects." My father leaned back in his chair. "Well, that sounds stable." The word stable sounded like an insult in his mouth. Then Daniel walked in. He was wearing an expensive suit and the same smug smile he'd had since childhood. "Emma," he said loudly, "you didn't tell me you were bringing a contractor." Michael didn't react. But I saw his eyes flick toward me briefly. He knew exactly what Daniel meant. Dinner got worse from there. Daniel spent most of the evening talking about his latest promotion at the marketing firm where he worked. Apparently he had just bought a luxury condo downtown. My parents were practically glowing with pride. "Daniel has always had ambition," my mother said proudly. Then she glanced at me. "Emma was always more quiet." Quiet. That was the polite version of disappointment. At one point Daniel leaned toward Michael and asked, "So how many houses have you built?" Michael smiled calmly. "A few." Daniel laughed. "Maybe someday you'll build one big enough for Emma." My parents chuckled, like it was a harmless joke. I felt my face burn. But Michael simply picked up his glass of water. "Maybe," he said. His calmness confused Daniel. It always confused people who expected a reaction. When we left that night, I apologized the moment we got into the car. "I'm sorry about them." Michael started the engine. "You don't have to. Apologize for other people. They're difficult." He thought for a moment. "No," he said slowly. "They're just used to underestimating you." I looked at him. "What makes you say that?" He smiled slightly. "Because they never ask the most important question." "And what's that?" He pulled the car into the street. "What you've actually accomplished." Over the next 2 years, Michael became the one person who saw me clearly. He didn't see the forgotten daughter. He didn't see Daniel's shadow. He saw someone who had built a life from nothing. And slowly, that started to matter more than my parents' approval. Then one night everything changed. Michael took me to the same coffee shop where we met. The place was nearly empty. The barista recognized us and smiled. "You two again?" Michael laughed. "It's tradition." We sat in the same corner table. The same one where he had first bought me coffee. After a few minutes he reached into his pocket. And suddenly my heart started racing. "Emma," he said quietly, "I know your family has never made things easy for you." I stayed silent. "But I've watched you fight for everything you have." He opened a small velvet box. Inside was a simple diamond ring. "Will you marry me?" For a moment I couldn't breathe. Not because of the ring, but because someone had finally chosen me. Not as a second option. Not as a backup plan. But first. "Yes," I whispered. Michael smiled. And just like that my life changed. But when I told my parents about the engagement, their reaction was exactly what you'd expect. My mother stared at the ring for a few seconds. "That's modest." My father frowned. "So you're marrying a construction worker?" Daniel leaned back in his chair. "Well, Emma, at least one of us married within our tax bracket." They laughed. All of them. And in that moment I realized something. They still believed I was the same invisible girl sitting quietly at the end of the table. They thought my wedding would just be another event where Daniel was the star. They thought they would control the story. What none of them realized was that my wedding day would be the first time in 20 years that the truth about our family would finally come out. And when it did, the golden child they loved so much would be the one. Everyone stopped believing. When my parents heard about the wedding plans, they immediately tried to take control. Not because they cared about the ceremony, but because weddings to them were performances. and every performance needed a star. In our family, that star had always been Daniel. 2 weeks after the engagement announcement, my mother invited us to dinner again. Michael and I already knew what was coming. Daniel's girlfriend, Sophia, was there too. She was exactly the kind of woman my parents loved. Beautiful, elegant, and from a wealthy family. My mother adored mentioning that last detail. Sophia's father owns 3 investment firms, she said proudly while pouring wine, like she personally owned them. Daniel put his arm around Sophia and smirked at me. Emma, he said casually, you should ask Sophia for wedding advice. Sophia tilted her head. Oh, Daniel grinned. She had a much bigger engagement ring than that. He glanced at my hand deliberately. My mother laughed lightly. Oh, Daniel, don't be rude. But she didn't sound like she meant it. Dinner continued like that for nearly an hour. Every topic somehow turned into another way to praise Daniel. His job, his condo, his salary, his future. At one point my father leaned toward Michael. So when exactly is the wedding? September, Michael replied calmly. My father nodded. Good. Then he said something that made the entire table go quiet. Daniel and Sophia are planning theirs next year. We wouldn't want Emma's wedding to overshadow it. For a moment I thought I had misheard him. Dad, I said slowly, you think my wedding might overshadow Daniel's? He shrugged. Well, weddings can be expensive. Daniel smirked again. And we all know Emma's budget is limited. Michael finally spoke. Our budget is fine. Daniel raised his eyebrow. Oh really? Then he leaned back in his chair and said the sentence that would eventually destroy him. Well, I guess we'll see how impressive it is. That night, as Michael drove us home, I stared out the window quietly. You're thinking about canceling the big ceremony, he said. I looked at him. How did you know? He smiled slightly. Because you hate giving them opportunities to humiliate you. I sighed. They always find one. Michael shook his head. Not this time. 3 months passed quickly. Wedding planning kept me busy. My parents barely helped. My mother complained constantly about the venue. It's small. It's simple. It's not very elegant. Daniel criticized everything else. The guest list. The decorations. The catering. He treated the entire wedding like a joke. But what annoyed him most was Michael. Because no matter how much Daniel tried to provoke him, Michael never reacted. And people like Daniel hate calm. One evening about a month before the wedding, Daniel called me. That almost never happened. Emma, he said, Dad and I were talking. That's never a good sign. He laughed. Relax. Then his tone changed. Dad thinks it would be better if the wedding ceremony stayed small. It is small. Smaller. I frowned. What does that mean? It means maybe you should limit the guest list. To who? Family. I stared at the phone. Daniel, you realize Michael's family exists, right? Yeah, he said casually. But they're not really our kind of people. For a moment I couldn't speak. Then I hung up. When I told Michael about the call, he didn't seem surprised. Your brother is scared, he said. Of what? He smiled faintly. Of losing control of the story. The wedding day arrived faster than I expected. The venue was a beautiful lakeside garden just outside the city. Simple. Elegant. Exactly what I wanted. When my parents arrived, my mother looked around critically. Well, she said. It's not terrible. Daniel arrived an hour later wearing a designer suit and an expression that suggested he was attending a charity event rather than his sister's wedding. Sophia walked beside him looking bored. But something about Daniel seemed different that day. Almost nervous. Like he was waiting for something. Or someone. At the time I didn't understand why. But within the next 2 hours, everyone at that wedding would discover the truth about my family. And Daniel would realize the biggest mistake he had ever made was believing I was still the invisible girl he grew up with. The morning of my wedding started quietly. Not peacefully. Just quietly. There's a difference. Peace usually means calm. Quiet sometimes means everyone is holding their breath before something explodes. I woke up at 6 in the small bridal suite attached to the lakeside venue. Soft sunlight filtered through the curtains, reflecting off the water outside. For a moment the entire world looked gentle and beautiful. Then my phone buzzed. A message from my mother. "Don't embarrass the family today." Stared at the screen for a long moment. After 27 years of disappointment, that was her wedding day advice. Not congratulations. Not "I'm proud of you." Just a warning. I placed the phone face down on the table and took a slow breath. Today wasn't about them. It couldn't be. Not anymore. By 8 o'clock the venue had started filling with quiet activity. Florists moved between tables placing small arrangements of white roses and eucalyptus leaves. The lake behind the ceremony area shimmered under the morning sun. Wooden chairs had been arranged in 2 neat rows facing the small arch where Michael and I would say our vows. Simple. Exactly how we planned it. Michael had insisted on helping organize everything himself. I'd watched him spend weekends meeting with vendors, checking contracts, and making sure every detail stayed within our budget. He never complained. He never acted like the wedding was some kind of burden. That alone made him different from most men I'd known. Around 9:30 my maid of honor, my friend Lily, arrived with coffee. "You look like someone who slept 3 hours, she said, handing me a cup. 4, I corrected. Luxury. She sat beside me on the couch and studied my face. "You nervous? About marrying Michael?" She shook her head. "About your family." I laughed softly. "That's not nervousness." "What is it?" "Experience." By 10:30, guests had started arriving. Michael's family came first. They walked into the venue smiling warmly, hugging people, laughing, helping the staff carry extra chairs. His mother even brought homemade pastries for the catering team. They treated the day like a celebration, not a competition. Watching them felt strange, almost unfamiliar. This was what supportive families looked like. I had seen it in movies, but experiencing it in real life was different. My parents arrived an hour later. They stepped out of their car like they were attending a corporate gala. My mother wore a designer navy dress and looked around the venue with the same expression someone might use when inspecting a hotel room that didn't quite meet expectations. "Well," she said, adjusting her purse, "at least the weather is nice." My father didn't say anything at all. He simply scanned the decorations, the chairs, the lake, the guests. Evaluating, judging, calculating. The same way he had evaluated every decision I'd made since childhood. Daniel arrived shortly after them. He stepped out of his car wearing an expensive charcoal suit, sunglasses, and the same confident smirk that had followed him through most of his life. Sophia walked beside him in a pale pink dress that probably cost more than my entire wedding outfit. Daniel glanced around the venue slowly. Then he chuckled. "Well," he said loudly enough for several nearby guests to hear. "I guess Emma decided to keep things rustic." My mother gave a soft laugh. "Daniel, don't start." But she was smiling. My father folded his arms. "I'm just glad she didn't try to organize something larger," he said quietly. "That could have been embarrassing. I wasn't supposed to hear that, but I did." By noon the ceremony area was nearly full. Guests sat chatting quietly while soft music played through hidden speakers near the lake. The breeze moved gently across the water, carrying the scent of flowers through the air. From the bridal suite window, everything looked almost perfect. Almost. Then Lily walked into the room holding her phone. "You might want to see this," she said. I took the phone from her. It was a social media post. From Daniel. A photo of himself and Sophia standing outside the venue. The caption read, "Attending my sister's budget wedding. Wish us luck surviving the decorations." Below it were laughing emojis. Hundreds of them. For a moment I felt the familiar sting of humiliation. The same feeling I'd known since childhood. The same feeling Daniel had perfected over decades. Lily looked furious. "Do you want me to comment something?" "No, but..." "No," I handed the phone back calmly. Let him enjoy the moment. 15 minutes before the ceremony started, Michael knocked on the bridal suite door. Traditionally, the bride and groom weren't supposed to see each other before the ceremony. But traditions had never mattered much to us. Lily opened the door. Michael stepped inside and immediately looked relieved. "There you are. Where else would I be?" He walked over and took my hands gently. "Are you okay?" I nodded. "My brother is being my brother." Michael smiled faintly. That sounds exhausting. It is. For a moment we stood there quietly. Then he leaned closer and spoke softly. Just remember something. What? No matter what happens today, the only thing that actually matters is that we walk out of here together. I squeezed his hands. That part I'm not worried about. The ceremony began exactly at 12:30. Guests stood as the music started. From the end of the aisle I could see everyone. Michael standing under the arch, Lily smiling encouragingly. Michael's parents watching with warm expressions. And my family. My mother sat stiffly beside my father. Daniel leaned back in his chair casually, one arm around Sophia. He looked bored. Like this entire moment was just a minor inconvenience in his day. For a brief second, I felt something unexpected. Not anger. Not sadness. Just distance. Daniel had spent our entire lives believing he was the center of the story. But standing there in my wedding dress, looking down that aisle, I realized something. For the first time in 27 years, he wasn't. The ceremony itself was simple and beautiful. Michael's voice stayed steady as he read his vows. Mine almost broke halfway through, but I managed to finish. When the officiant finally said, "You may kiss the bride," the entire audience applauded. Even my parents. Even Daniel. For a moment, everything seemed normal. Almost peaceful. But weddings have two parts. The ceremony. And the reception. And it was during the reception that everything finally began to unravel. The reception took place in a glass pavilion overlooking the lake. Tables filled the room, decorated with small candles and white flowers. Soft music played in the background while guests talked and laughed. Dinner was served. Toasts began. Michael's best man spoke first. Then Lily. Both speeches were warm, funny, and heartfelt. People laughed. Some even cried. Then Daniel stood up. No one had asked him to give a speech. But Daniel had never needed permission to take attention. He raised his glass casually. "Since I'm the bride's brother," he said, smiling, "I thought I should say a few words." The room quieted politely. I felt Michael's hand tighten around mine under the table. Daniel cleared his throat dramatically. "You know," he began, "Emma has always been the quiet one in our family." A few guests chuckled politely. "But growing up," he continued, "we never really expected her to do something like this." He gestured around the room. "This whole wedding thing." My stomach tightened. Daniel smiled wider. "I mean, when you grow up watching your little sister struggle with, well, everything." Michael's hand tightened again. "But somehow," Daniel continued, raising his glass toward me, "she managed to land a hard-working construction guy." Some guests shifted uncomfortably. Daniel ignored them. "So here's to Emma," he said. "Proof that even the most unexpected people can sometimes get lucky." A few awkward claps followed. But the atmosphere in the room had changed. The warmth from earlier had cooled. Daniel sat down looking satisfied. Like he had just delivered the performance of the evening. What he didn't realize was that his speech had just started a chain reaction he couldn't stop. Because 5 minutes later, someone else would stand up. Someone no one in my family expected. And the moment that person began speaking, everything Daniel believed about our family would start collapsing in front of everyone. For a few seconds after Daniel sat down, the room remained quiet. Not the comfortable kind of quiet. The awkward kind. The kind that spreads slowly across a crowd when people realize they've just witnessed something unpleasant, but don't know how to react. A few guests shifted in their chairs. Someone coughed softly near the back of the room. Michael's best man leaned toward him and whispered something under his breath. I didn't need to hear it to know what it probably was. Daniel had always been good at turning moments that belonged to other people into moments about himself. But tonight felt different. Because something about the room had changed. People had noticed. Michael squeezed my hand under the table. "You okay?" he whispered. I nodded slowly. "I'm used to him." Michael didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked across the room at Daniel for a moment. Then he leaned slightly closer to me. Not for much longer. I didn't understand what he meant. Not yet. The master of ceremonies, one of Michael's cousins, cleared his throat and stepped back up to the microphone. "Well," he said with a polite smile, "that was memorable." A few scattered laughs broke the tension. Before we move on to dessert, he continued, there's actually one more person who asked to say a few words. That caught my attention immediately. I turned toward Michael. Did you plan another speech? He shook his head. No. Across the room, Daniel looked mildly irritated. Probably because he assumed the speeches were over, and the spotlight would return to him during the rest of the reception. The MC glanced toward the back of the room. Mr. Harrison? For a moment I didn't recognize the name. Then an older man slowly stood from one of the tables near the window. Tall, silver-haired, wearing a dark suit. The moment my father saw him, his posture stiffened. I noticed it immediately. Something about this man clearly made him uncomfortable. The man walked calmly to the microphone. Guests watched curiously. He adjusted the microphone slightly and smiled politely at the room. Good evening, everyone, he said in a calm, steady voice. My name is Robert Harrison. He paused briefly. I apologize for interrupting the celebration. I promise I won't take long. The room remained quiet. Then he glanced toward me. And Emma, he said gently, I hope you won't mind me sharing a few thoughts. I blinked in surprise. I don't think we've met. He smiled slightly. No, but I've known about you for a very long time. A faint ripple of curiosity moved through the guests. Across the room, my father suddenly looked very pale. Robert continued speaking calmly. First, I want to congratulate Emma and Michael on their marriage. He raised his glass slightly. A wedding is one of the few moments in life where two people make a promise that isn't about convenience or advantage, but about commitment. Michael nodded respectfully. Robert's eyes moved slowly across the room. And tonight has been a beautiful reminder of that. Then he paused. And also, a reminder of something else. Now people were leaning forward in their seats. Even Daniel looked slightly confused. Robert rested his hands lightly on the podium. Many years ago, he continued, I had the privilege of knowing Emma's grandfather. That sentence immediately caught my attention. My grandfather? I asked softly. Robert nodded. Yes. The room remained silent. Your grandfather, Thomas Whitmore, was one of the most disciplined and principled businessmen I've ever met. My father shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Robert noticed. His eyes moved toward him briefly. Your father worked with him for a time. Now several guests turned toward my father. My father cleared his throat. Yes, well, that was a long time ago. Robert smiled slightly. Yes. His tone remained calm. But certain things from the past have a way of remaining relevant. Daniel suddenly leaned forward in his chair. Excuse me, he said loudly. What exactly does this have to do with the wedding? Robert looked at him calmly. You must be Daniel. Daniel frowned slightly. Yes. Robert nodded. I've heard quite a bit about you. Daniel smirked. Well, I hope it was impressive. Robert didn't smile. That depends on how one defines impressive. The room went completely quiet. Robert returned his attention to the microphone. As I mentioned earlier, he said calmly, I worked closely with Emma's grandfather for many years. He was a man who believed strongly in preparation, in long-term planning, and in protecting the people he loved. I felt a strange knot forming in my stomach. Robert reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and slowly removed a small envelope. The simple action immediately drew everyone's attention. Several years before his passing, Robert continued, Thomas Whitmore asked me to safeguard a set of legal documents. Now my father looked like he might faint. Daniel noticed his reaction. Dad? He asked quietly. But my father didn't answer. He was staring at the envelope in Robert's hand like it contained something dangerous. Robert placed the envelope gently on the podium. Those documents, he continued calmly, contained instructions that were to be carried out only under specific circumstances. My heart started beating faster. What circumstances? I asked. Robert looked directly at me. The day his granddaughter got married. The entire room went silent. Daniel let out a short laugh. You're telling me my grandfather left some kind of wedding gift? Robert didn't react. One could call it that. My father suddenly stood up. That's enough, he said sharply. This isn't the place for legal discussions. Robert looked at him calmly. Actually, he replied, this is exactly the place your father specified. My father froze. Guests were now whispering quietly. Something big was happening. Everyone could feel it. Robert opened the envelope. Inside were several folded sheets of paper. He lifted the top document carefully. These papers, he said, represent the final instructions of Thomas Whitmore regarding the future of his company and estate. Daniel laughed again. Wait, are you saying there's some inheritance thing happening right now? Robert looked at him briefly. In a sense. Daniel leaned back smugly. Well, that's easy then. He gestured casually toward himself. I'm the oldest grandson. Robert remained silent for a moment. Then he said the sentence that made the entire room freeze. No, you're not. For several seconds no one spoke. Daniel frowned. What does that mean? Robert turned another page slowly. It means, he said calmly, that according to your grandfather's legal records. His eyes moved toward me. Emma Whitmore is his only legal heir. The room exploded into shocked murmurs. Daniel stared at him. What? My mother looked completely confused. My father closed his eyes like he had been expecting this moment for years. And suddenly, the story my family had told for decades started falling apart. For several seconds after Robert finished speaking, the room was completely silent. Not the polite silence people show during speeches. The heavy kind. The kind that happens when an entire room realizes something important has just been said, but no one fully understands it yet. Then the whispers started. Quiet at first, then spreading across the reception hall like a slow wave. Did he say only heir? What company? Is this real? Across the room, Daniel was still staring at Robert like he had misheard him. Wait, he said finally, laughing in disbelief. That's not possible. Robert remained calm. I assure you it is. Daniel shook his head. No, that's ridiculous. He pointed at me. She barely talks to the family. Then he pointed at himself. I'm the one who helped Dad with Grandpa's business contacts. I'm the one who studied marketing. I'm the one who... Robert raised his hand slightly. And yet, he said calmly, none of that changes the legal documentation. Daniel's smile disappeared. My mother looked from Robert to my father then back again. James, she said quietly, what is he talking about? My father didn't answer immediately. His face had gone pale. For the first time in my entire life, he looked like someone who had completely lost control of a situation. Dad. Daniel pressed. My father finally stood up slowly. This discussion, he said stiffly, should not be happening at a wedding. Robert nodded slightly. You're right. Then he looked around the room. But unfortunately, this was the exact location your father requested. That sentence hit the room like another shockwave. I felt Michael's hand tighten gently around mine. Emma, he whispered, did you know anything about this? I shook my head slowly. No, and I was telling the truth. I had never heard my grandfather mention anything like this. In fact, I barely remembered him at all. He had died when I was 9. And after his funeral, my father had rarely spoken about him again. Daniel suddenly laughed again. But this time the laugh sounded forced. Okay, he said loudly. Let's assume this is real. He looked around at the guests. My grandfather owned a small logistics company 30 years ago. He shrugged. It's probably worth what? A couple $100,000 now. He glanced back at me. If Emma wants it, she can have it. Some guests chuckled awkwardly. Daniel spread his arms dramatically. Congratulations, little sister. You just inherited Grandpa's dusty old warehouse. Robert didn't smile. Instead, he slowly folded the first document and picked up another. That would have been true, he said calmly. 20 years ago. Daniel's grin faded slightly. But since then, Robert continued, Whitmore Logistics has expanded into 4 states. The room quieted again. Robert continued speaking in the same steady voice. Over the last 2 decades, the company has acquired multiple distribution contracts and commercial development properties. Daniel frowned. So, Robert looked directly at him. So the current valuation of Whitmore Logistics is approximately $86 million. For a moment it felt like the entire room stopped breathing. Someone dropped a fork at one of the tables. The sound echoed loudly in the silence. Daniel blinked. 80 what? Robert repeated calmly. $86 million. My mother gasped. Michael's eyes widened slightly beside me. Guests were now whispering much louder. But the person who reacted the most dramatically was my father. He slammed his hand on the table. That number is an estimate, he snapped. Robert turned toward him calmly. It's the most recent valuation from last quarter. My father's face tightened. You have no right discussing private financial matters here. Robert tilted his head slightly. Actually, he said, I have every right. Then he lifted another page. As executor of Thomas Whitmore's estate. Daniel stood up so suddenly his chair nearly fell over. This is insane, he said loudly. You're telling me my sister suddenly owns an $86 million company? Robert looked at him quietly. No, Daniel froze. No, he repeated. Robert shook his head. She doesn't own it yet. The entire room leaned forward. Then what does she own? Daniel demanded. Robert folded his hands calmly. She owns the controlling inheritance rights. Daniel stared at him. What does that even mean? Robert answered simply. It means the company will legally transfer to Emma today, if the conditions set by your grandfather have been fulfilled. Now everyone in the room was completely silent. Even the waitstaff had stopped moving. What conditions? I asked quietly. Robert turned toward me. There were 3. My heart was beating so loudly I could feel it in my ears. Robert lifted another document. First, he said calmly, Emma had to reach the age of 27 without receiving any financial support from the company. My father looked away. Robert continued. Second, she had to build an independent career without relying on the Whitmore name. Michael squeezed my hand again. And third, Robert said slowly, she had to marry someone who had no financial interest in the inheritance. Daniel burst out laughing again. Wait a second. He pointed at Michael. You're telling me my sister marrying a construction worker somehow qualifies her for $86 million? Robert didn't react. Yes. Daniel's laugh stopped abruptly. My mother suddenly looked at my father again. James, she whispered. Did you know about this? My father rubbed his forehead slowly. Yes. The single word hit the room like another explosion. Daniel spun toward him. You knew. My father didn't answer immediately. Instead he looked at me. For the first time in years, he actually looked at me. Your grandfather believed, he said quietly, that the person who inherited his company needed to understand struggle. Daniel stared at him in disbelief. And you never told us? My father's jaw tightened. He specifically forbade it. Daniel looked like he was about to explode. So instead you just what? Ignored Emma for 20 years. My father didn't answer. Because the truth was already obvious. Robert spoke again. Thomas Whitmore believed character revealed itself through hardship. His eyes moved across the room. So he designed a test. Daniel shook his head violently. This is ridiculous. But Robert wasn't finished. However, he continued calmly, there was also a 4th clause. The room went completely still again. Daniel frowned. What 4th clause? Robert looked directly at him. The inheritance could be revoked if evidence showed the family attempted to manipulate or control the outcome. My father's face drained of color. Daniel didn't understand yet. What does that mean? Robert answered quietly. It means if Emma was ever intentionally mistreated, in order to influence the inheritance, he paused, the estate could be reassigned. For the first time since the speech began, Daniel looked nervous. And my father looked terrified. Because suddenly, the entire room was remembering something. Daniel's speech. His insults. His mockery. The humiliation he had just delivered. In front of dozens of witnesses. Robert slowly folded the documents again. And now, he said calmly, we must determine whether those conditions have been violated. For several seconds after Robert finished speaking, the entire reception hall felt frozen in place. No one reached for their drinks. No one touched their food. Even the music that had been playing softly in the background had somehow stopped. Every single person in the room was looking at the same three people. My father, my brother, and me. Because suddenly the story everyone thought they understood had completely changed. Daniel was the first one to break the silence. This is insane, he said, shaking his head. You can't just show up at a wedding and accuse people of manipulating an inheritance. Robert remained calm. I didn't accuse anyone. Daniel pointed angrily toward the documents on the podium. You literally just said the estate could be revoked if Emma was mistreated. Robert nodded slightly. That is what the clause states. Daniel threw his hands into the air. So what? Families argue. That's normal. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable looks. Because what Daniel called arguing they had just watched happen 15 minutes earlier. And it hadn't looked normal. My father finally spoke. His voice sounded strained. Robert, he said carefully, you and I both know my father trusted me to manage his company after he passed away. Robert nodded once. Yes. So let's not pretend I've done anything unethical. Robert didn't respond immediately. Instead, he picked up another sheet from the folder. I have here a collection of written observations your father asked me to maintain. My father's eyes widened slightly. You kept records? Robert looked at him evenly. That was my responsibility. Daniel looked between them impatiently. What records? Robert glanced down at the paper. Notes regarding Emma's development over the years. Now everyone in the room turned toward me. Even Michael looked surprised. You mean? Grandpa was tracking Emma's life? Daniel asked. In a sense, Robert replied. Your grandfather believed that character reveals itself over time. Daniel scoffed. So what? You followed Emma around with a clipboard for 20 years. Robert shook his head. No, he tapped the document lightly. Your father sent regular reports. The entire room went quiet again. Daniel slowly turned toward my father. Dad? My father's jaw tightened. Those were business updates. Robert looked at him calmly. They included personal observations as well. Daniel's confusion turned into suspicion. What kind of observations? Robert read from the page. Year 2009. Emma began working part-time while attending university. No financial assistance requested from family. He flipped to the next page. Year 2011. Emma graduated with honors while maintaining 2 jobs. Another page. Year 2013. Emma moved into her first apartment independently. Guests were now listening carefully. Robert continued reading. Year 2017. Emma promoted to senior accounting position. Daniel frowned. Wait. He pointed at me. Why didn't I know any of this? No one answered him. Because the answer was obvious. My father had never bothered to share. Robert set the papers down. For 2 decades, he said calmly, Emma has met every condition your grandfather established. Daniel crossed his arms defensively. Fine. Then he pointed at Michael. But the third condition was about who she married. Robert nodded. Yes. Daniel laughed again. So how exactly does a construction manager qualify? Michael finally spoke. His voice was calm. I never claimed to qualify for anything. Daniel rolled his eyes. Of course you didn't. Then he turned back toward Robert. This whole thing is ridiculous. Robert tilted his head slightly. Which part? The idea that Emma suddenly inherits a company because she married a guy who pours concrete. Several guests murmured uncomfortably. Michael didn't react. But Robert did. He looked directly at Daniel. Construction management is not pouring concrete. Daniel smirked. Sure. Robert picked up another document. Michael Turner is currently the Regional Development Director for North Point Infrastructure. The name caught the attention of several guests immediately. One man at a nearby table whispered, North Point. Daniel frowned. What about it? Robert answered calmly. North Point Infrastructure is the company responsible for building 3 of the largest commercial logistics centers in this state. Daniel shrugged. So? Robert looked at him evenly. Those facilities collectively increase Whitmore Logistics market value by 30%. Daniel blinked. What? Robert continued speaking in the same calm tone. Michael's work has indirectly contributed to the expansion of your grandfather's company. Daniel stared at Michael now. Wait. You knew about Whitmore Logistics? Michael shook his head. No, Robert confirmed it. That is correct. Daniel looked confused again. Then how is that relevant? Robert folded the document carefully. Because your grandfather's final condition was never about wealth. He glanced toward me briefly. It was about integrity. Understand, my father suddenly stood up again. That's enough. His voice sounded sharper now. This entire discussion is inappropriate. Robert looked at him calmly. Your father disagreed. My father pointed toward the guests. You're embarrassing the family. Robert raised an eyebrow slightly. Am I? Then he gestured toward the room. Or are the past 20 years doing that on their own? A few quiet murmurs moved through the crowd. Daniel looked increasingly agitated. Okay, this is getting ridiculous, he snapped. You're acting like we abused Emma or something. Robert didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked toward the audience. Several guests here tonight have witnessed the family dynamic firsthand. Now people were shifting uncomfortably, because everyone remembered Daniel's speech. Robert continued. And of course, he turned back toward Daniel, there is also the matter of the financial records. Daniel frowned. What financial records? Robert's expression didn't change. The ones showing withdrawals from the company over the past 8 years. My father's chair scraped loudly against the floor as he stood. That information is confidential. Robert met his eyes calmly. It was. Daniel looked back and forth between them. Dad, what is he talking about? My father didn't answer. Robert spoke instead. Several large transfers were made from Whitmore Logistics reserve accounts. Daniel shrugged. So, Robert continued quietly. The money was used to finance Daniel's lifestyle. Now the room exploded into whispers again. Daniel's face turned red. That's not true. Robert slid a sheet across the podium. Luxury condo purchase. Another. Vehicle lease agreements. Another. Private investment losses. Daniel looked at the documents like they were written in another language. Dad. My father finally spoke. It was a temporary arrangement. Robert corrected him gently. It was $8 million. The number hung in the air like a thunderclap. 8 million. Guests were openly staring now. Daniel looked stunned. You used the company's money for me? My father didn't answer. Robert did. Yes. Daniel looked at the floor. For the first time all evening. He didn't have a joke. Robert folded the documents again slowly. And that brings us, he said calmly, to the final decision. The room went completely silent. Because everyone understood now. The inheritance wasn't the real story anymore. The real story was what would happen next. Robert looked directly at me. Emma Whitmore, he paused. The future of your grandfather's company now depends on a single choice. My heart started pounding again. What choice? I asked quietly. Robert answered simply. Whether you believe your family deserves a second chance. Across the room, Daniel and my father were staring at me. For the first time in their lives, they weren't in control of the outcome. I was. And suddenly, the invisible girl they ignored for 20 years was the only person who could decide their future. When Robert finished speaking, every eye in the room turned toward me. I had imagined my wedding day many times growing up. Sometimes it was beautiful. Sometimes it was awkward. But never, not once, had I imagined standing in front of a room full of people while holding the future of my entire family in my hands. The room was so quiet I could hear the soft movement of the lake outside the glass pavilion. My father was staring at me. Daniel too. For the first time in our lives, neither of them looked confident. They looked uncertain. Almost afraid. Michael leaned slightly closer to me. You don't have to decide anything right now, he whispered. His voice was calm, steady, grounding. I nodded slowly, but Robert was still standing at the microphone, waiting patiently. The guests were waiting too. And suddenly I realized something strange. All my life I had been the person at the end of the table. The quiet one. the invisible one, the person no one expected to speak. But right now, everyone was waiting for me. Daniel was the first one who couldn't handle the silence anymore. "This is ridiculous," he said loudly. "You're putting Emma in an impossible position." Robert looked at him calmly. "Your grandfather believed responsibility reveals character." Daniel scoffed. "Oh please." He gestured toward me. "She's not some corporate executive. She's an accountant." My father finally spoke again. "Daniel, stop talking." Daniel turned toward him in disbelief. "What?" But my father wasn't looking at him. He was still looking at me. And for the first time in years, there was something in his expression I had never seen before. Regret. I stood up slowly. My legs felt strangely light, like I was walking through water. Michael stood with me instinctively, but I gently squeezed his hand. "I'm okay," I whispered. He nodded and sat back down. I walked toward the microphone. Every step across the room felt surreal. Guests watched quietly. Some looked curious. Some looked sympathetic. A few looked excited. Because people love watching family drama, as long as it's not their own. When I reached the podium, Robert stepped slightly to the side. He gave me a small, respectful nod. "This decision belongs to you." I took a breath. Then I looked at the room, at the guests, at Michael, and finally at my family. Daniel crossed his arms. "You don't seriously believe all this nonsense, do you?" I didn't answer him right away. Instead, I asked something else. "Did you know?" Daniel frowned. "Know what?" "About the inheritance." He laughed. "Of course not." Then he looked at my father. "Did you?" My father hesitated. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he sighed slowly. "Yes." The room filled with quiet murmurs again. Daniel stared at him. "You knew there was $80 million involved? And you didn't tell me?" My father's voice sounded tired. "Your grandfather's instructions were very clear." Daniel shook his head. "That's insane." Then he pointed at me again. "So instead you just let Emma think she was nothing for 20 years? My father didn't answer. Because he couldn't. I felt something strange then. Not anger. Not sadness. Just clarity. For most of my life I had believed my parents ignored me because I wasn't good enough. Not successful enough. Not impressive enough. But standing there now, I realized something else. They hadn't ignored me because I was weak. They had ignored me because they believed Daniel was the safer choice. The predictable one. The golden child. They had invested everything in him. And now that investment had collapsed. Daniel suddenly looked back at Robert. "This whole thing is still stupid," he snapped. "So Emma inherits the company. Fine." He shrugged. "It doesn't mean she knows how to run it." Several guests shifted uncomfortably again. Robert didn't respond. Daniel continued. "She's never managed a business." He gestured around the room. "She's never led a company." Then he smirked. "You'll probably end up hiring Dad to run everything anyway." My father didn't react. But the tension in the room grew thicker. Because everyone understood what Daniel was really saying. That even now, he believed I wasn't capable. I looked at him calmly. "Daniel." He raised an eyebrow. "What? When was the last time you spoke to me without insulting me?" He shrugged. "That's just how we joke." I tilted my head slightly. "Is it?" The room was silent again. Daniel rolled his eyes. "Oh, come on. Don't act like a victim now." That word, victim, hung in the air for a moment. Then I asked another question. "Do you remember my 8th birthday?" Daniel blinked. "What?" "The cake." He frowned. "What about it?" I looked directly at him. "The one with your name on it." Daniel opened his mouth to respond, then stopped. As suddenly he remembered. My father looked down at the floor. My mother looked uncomfortable. But Daniel just shrugged again. "That was 20 years ago." "Exactly," I said quietly. "And nothing has changed." The room stayed silent. Guests were listening carefully now. Not just to the argument, but to the history behind it. Because family dynamics have a way of revealing themselves slowly, piece by piece. And tonight, the entire puzzle was finally visible. Robert glanced at his watch briefly. "Emma," he said gently. "The decision. I nodded. Right. The decision. The future of the company. The inheritance. The power my family had never expected me to hold. I looked at my father. Then at Daniel. For the first time in my life. They weren't judging me. They were waiting. And suddenly I understood something important. For 27 years I had wanted their approval. But standing there now, I realized I didn't need it anymore. I turned back toward Robert. I have a question, I said. Of course. If the inheritance transfers to me today, does that include full authority over the company? Robert nodded. Yes. And that includes financial oversight? Yes. And executive appointments? Yes. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Why are you asking all this? I ignored him. Then I asked the final question. If the company suffered financial losses due to mismanagement, Robert answered calmly, the new owner would have the legal authority to investigate and restructure leadership. Daniel's expression changed immediately. Wait a second. But I wasn't finished yet. I turned slowly back toward my family, and for the first time all evening, I smiled. Not an angry smile. Not a bitter one. Just a calm, quiet smile. Because I had finally realized something. Revenge wasn't necessary. Justice was already happening. I've made my decision, I said. The entire room held its breath. Does what I said next would determine everything. I've made my decision. For a moment no one in the room moved. Not the guests. Not the waitstaff. Not even Daniel. It felt like the entire reception hall was holding its breath. Because suddenly this wedding had turned into something none of them expected. Not a celebration. A verdict. Daniel leaned forward in his chair. Emma, he said, forcing a smile. Let's be reasonable here. Reasonable. The word almost made me laugh. For 27 years, the word reasonable in my family had meant one thing. Do whatever benefits Daniel. But tonight was different. Tonight I was the one standing at the microphone. And for the first time in my life, they were the ones waiting. I looked at Robert. You said the company transfers to me if the conditions are fulfilled. That is correct, he said. And you also said there's a clause about manipulation. Yes. I nodded slowly. Good. Then I turned toward the room again. I'm accepting the inheritance. The reaction was immediate. Gasps. Whispers. A few quiet claps from Michael's side of the family. Daniel stared at me. Then he smiled. A confident, relieved smile. See, he said, turning toward our parents. I told you she'd take it. My mother exhaled in visible relief. My father closed his eyes briefly. But Daniel wasn't finished. He leaned back comfortably. Now we can all calm down. He gestured toward my father. Dad can keep running the company like he always has. Then he looked back at me. And maybe I can finally get involved too. The arrogance in his voice was almost impressive. Daniel truly believed the story had ended. He believed the inheritance meant everything would continue exactly the same way it always had. But he had forgotten one small detail. The inheritance didn't just come with money. It came with power. I looked at him calmly. No, the word landed quietly. But it echoed through the room like thunder. Daniel blinked. What? I said no. His smile disappeared. What do you mean no? I turned back to Robert. You also said the new owner has full financial oversight. Yes. And the authority to investigate financial activity. Yes. Daniel shifted in his chair. Why are we still talking about this? I ignored him. And if company funds were used improperly, Robert finished the sentence calmly, the owner may pursue legal recovery. Daniel froze. My father's face turned pale again. I looked directly at my father. $8 million. No one in the room spoke. Is that the correct number? My father rubbed his forehead slowly. Yes. And it was taken from company reserves. Yes. Without my grandfather's approval. He hesitated, then nodded once. Yes. Daniel suddenly stood up. Okay, this is getting ridiculous. He pointed at me angrily. You're not seriously accusing Dad of something illegal. I tilted my head slightly. Am I? Daniel laughed nervously. Of course you are. But I wasn't finished. I turned to Robert again. If the company suffered $8 million in unauthorized withdrawals, Robert answered carefully, the new owner could request repayment. Daniel looked between us. You're joking. Robert continued calmly. If repayment was not possible, Daniel's voice rose. Dad doesn't owe the company anything. Robert finished the sentence anyway. Legal proceedings could follow. The room erupted into loud whispers again. Daniel turned toward my father. Dad. But my father wasn't looking at him. He was looking at me. And the regret in his eyes was finally impossible to ignore. Emma, he said quietly, I never meant for things to go this far. That sentence hit harder than I expected. Not because it was cruel, because it was honest. He hadn't meant for it to go this far. He had meant for things to stay exactly the same forever. Daniel as the golden child. Me as the afterthought. But life had other plans. Daniel slammed his hand on the table. This is insane. He pointed at me again. You're doing this out of revenge. I shook my head. No. Then what is it? I answered calmly. Accountability. The word seemed to confuse him. Daniel had spent his entire life avoiding consequences. He had no idea what accountability looked like. The room fell quiet again. Everyone was watching, waiting, because they understood something now. This wasn't just about money. It was about justice. I took a slow breath. Then I said the words that ended everything. The company will receive the $8 million back. Daniel laughed loudly. From who? I looked directly at him. You. The laugh died instantly. What? You benefited from the withdrawals. Daniel shook his head violently. That's not my problem. Actually, Robert said calmly, it is. Daniel turned toward him. What? The financial transfers were recorded as personal support payments. Daniel looked confused. So, Robert continued, which means they were legally issued in your name. The color drained from Daniel's face. You're lying. Robert slid another document onto the podium. I'm afraid not. For a moment Daniel simply stared at the paper. Then he looked back at my father. You said it was handled. My father looked exhausted. It was supposed to be temporary. Daniel's voice rose. You told me it wasn't my responsibility. My father didn't respond. Because now everyone in the room understood the truth. Daniel hadn't just spent money. He had spent money that never belonged to him. I spoke again. The company will offer a repayment plan. Daniel stared at me. A repayment plan? Yes. For $8 million. His voice cracked. That would take decades. Probably. Daniel laughed bitterly. You're ruining my life. I shook my head. No. You ruined it yourself. The silence that followed felt strangely peaceful. For the first time all evening. No one was arguing. No one was mocking. No one was pretending. The truth was simply sitting there in the middle of the room. And everyone could see it. My father stood up slowly. Emma. I looked at him. I'm sorry, he said quietly. The words felt strange. Like hearing a language I didn't quite understand. Because my father had never apologized before. Not once in my entire life. I nodded slightly. I know. That was all I said. Because apologies don't erase 20 years. But sometimes, they're still worth hearing. Robert closed the folder of documents. Then the transfer will proceed as planned. Guests began whispering again. But this time the whispers sounded different. Less shocked. More satisfied. People love seeing justice unfold. Michael stood up beside me and took my hand. Mrs. Whitmore Turner, he said quietly. I laughed. That's going to take time to get used to. He smiled. We have time. Across the room Daniel sat down slowly. For the first time since I had known him, he looked small. Not powerful. Not confident. Just small. My father walked toward the exit. Before leaving he turned back once. Emma, he said. Yes. I hope someday you'll let me make this right. I thought about that for a moment. Then I answered honestly. Maybe. He nodded once, and left. The reception slowly came back to life after that. Guests returned to their conversations. Music started playing again. Waiters brought out dessert. But the mood of the room had changed. Because everyone knew they had witnessed something unusual. Not just a wedding. A reckoning. Later that evening, as the sun set over the lake, Michael and I stood outside watching the water. "Did today turn out how you expected?" he asked. I laughed softly. "Not even close." He smiled. "But are you happy?" I thought about the question carefully. For most of my life, happiness had felt complicated. Connected to approval. Connected to expectations. Connected to family. But standing there beside Michael, watching the light fade across the lake, I realized something simple. "Yes," I said. "I am." Because sometimes the people who ignore you your entire life end up teaching you the most important lesson. You don't need their approval to succeed. And the child they once treated like nothing can still grow up to become the one holding everything together. And that was the night my family finally understood something. The daughter they ignored for 27 years was the only one who had truly earned the future they tried to control.